At my 70th birthday party, my daughter handed me a cake with an expiration date from 2 weeks ago. The frosting had started to separate, the edges curled and dry. I took a bite anyway, forcing a smile for the cameras. Then my teeth hit something hard, a folded note buried in the stale vanilla. What I read on that paper made my hands shake, not from age, but from a fury I hadn't felt since I stood on the deck of a hospital ship off the coast of Vietnam. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The silence that followed was thick, unnatural. The kind of silence that fills a room when everyone sees something wrong but no one wants to name it. I was still standing at the head of the table, the cake knife in one hand, the note clutched in the other. My reading glasses had slipped down my nose, and through them, I could see the words clearly, written in my daughter's precise handwriting. Mom's lived a good life. Simple tastes, simple needs. Why waste money on fancy cakes for simple people? My chest tightened. Not from the words themselves, I'd survived worse in my 70 years, but from the casual cruelty of them. From the fact that my daughter, my only child, had written them knowing I'd find them. Maybe even wanting me to. Around the table sat 19 people. My neighbors from the old brownstone in South Philadelphia where I'd lived for 42 years. Lorraine Jackson from the unit below mine, who still brought me her famous peach cobbler every Sunday. Miguel Ortega from the corner bodega, who'd extended me credit during the lean months after my husband Bernard died. Reverend Patricia Hall from Bethel AME, who'd buried my husband and christened my granddaughter. And then there was my daughter, Camille. 39 years old, standing near the archway in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her husband, Preston, beside her checking his Rolex every few minutes. Their daughter, my granddaughter Zara, 8 years old, sat at the far end of the table, iPad glowing in her small hands, wireless earbuds blocking out the world around her. Camille's face was smooth, practiced. She smiled the way executives smile in boardroom photographs, like she'd perfected it through years of corporate training. But her eyes, those I recognized. They were assessing, calculating, the same way she'd looked at her dolls as a girl, deciding which ones were worth displaying and which could be donated. I folded the note carefully, slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, and cut the cake. The knife sank through layers of dry sponge and hardened frosting that had started to pull away from the edges. I served myself a piece, then passed plates around the table. No one mentioned the expiration date printed clearly on the side of the box, still visible where Camille had torn off the price tag but left the rest of the packaging intact. Lorraine took a small bite, chewed carefully, and set down her fork with deliberate gentleness. Her eyes found mine across the table, warm brown eyes that had witnessed too much history to be fooled by surface politeness. Miguel cleared his throat, his weathered hands folding his napkin. "Elena, you didn't have to go to all this trouble for us." "I didn't," I said simply, my voice steady. "Camille brought the cake." The words landed like pebbles dropped into still water. Ripples of discomfort spread across the faces gathered around my dining table. Camille shifted her weight from one expensive heel to the other, her smile tightening at the corners like a wire being pulled taut. "I picked it up on the way over," she said, her voice too bright, too dismissive. "Last-minute errand, you know how Sundays are." I figured, Mom won't mind. She's never been particular about these things. "That's true," I said, meeting her eyes. "I've never been particular." The double meaning hung in the air like smoke. I saw Reverend Hall's eyebrows rise slightly behind her glasses. Lorraine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I took another bite of the cake. It tasted like sawdust and disappointment, the artificial vanilla flavoring coating my tongue with chemical sweetness. But I chewed it slowly, deliberately. Because that's what you do when your daughter hands you garbage and expects you to smile. You swallow it. You've been swallowing it for years, each slight, each condescension, each reminder that you no longer fit into the life she's built. My mind drifted, the way minds do after 7 decades, back through layers of birthdays. Back to when Camille was small, when Bernard was alive, when this apartment felt like a sanctuary instead of a museum of memories I could no longer afford to maintain. Flashback, 36 years ago. Bernard and I never had much money. I worked as a nurse at Temple University Hospital, pulling double shifts in the pediatric ward. Bernard drove a city bus, Route 23, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 when they needed extra coverage. His hands were always tired from gripping that large steering wheel, his back perpetually aching from the driver's seat. But on Camille's birthdays, we saved. For months, we'd tuck away $5 bills in an old shoebox hidden in the back of our bedroom closet, behind the winter coats we rarely needed in Philadelphia's mild climate. By the time her birthday arrived, we'd have enough for a real cake from Delancey's Bakery on South Street, the kind with real buttercream and fresh flowers made from spun sugar, with Camille's name written in elegant script across the top. I remember her 6th birthday like it was last Tuesday instead of 33 years ago. We'd saved $62. The cake alone cost $28. But when Bernard went to pick it up, old Mrs. Delancey herself came out from behind the counter, wiping flour from her apron. "For little Camille?" she asked, her Eastern European accent still thick after 40 years in America. Bernard nodded, counting out the bills carefully. Mrs. Delancey disappeared into the back and returned with a small box tied with ribbon. "Macarons," she said, pressing them into Bernard's hands. "French ones. For the birthday girl. No charge." That evening, Camille's face glowed in the candlelight. 6 candles, one for each year she'd been breathing, laughing, filling our lives with purpose. Bernard sang in his deep baritone, slightly off-key, and I harmonized badly, and Camille clapped her small hands together in pure joy. When she blew out the candles in one breath, I asked her what she wished for. "A doctor's kit," she said immediately, her eyes shining. "A real one, like you use, Mama. With a stethoscope that really works." Bernard and I exchanged a look across the table. We didn't have money for a real medical kit. Not even the toy versions they sold at the department stores downtown. But that summer, I picked up extra shifts. I worked overnight when Camille slept, came home exhausted to make her breakfast, slept a few hours, then went back. Bernard took on weekend routes. By September, we had saved $173. I found a medical supply store in Center City that sold retired equipment. The stethoscope was real, slightly worn but functional. I bought it along with a blood pressure cuff, a reflex hammer, bandages, and a small doctor's bag I found at a thrift store that I cleaned and polished until it shined. On her 7th birthday, I placed the bag in her room while she slept. When she woke and saw it, she screamed, actually screamed with pure, unfiltered joy. She ran to me and threw her arms around my waist so hard I stumbled backward. "Best mama in the whole world," she shouted, her voice muffled against my stomach. Bernard stood in the doorway, his eyes wet with tears he'd never admit were there. I held on to that moment for decades. Even now, sitting at this table with the stale cake and the cruel note burning in my pocket, I could still feel her small arms squeezing tight, still hear her voice trembling with happiness. Best mama in the whole world. Back to present. The party limped forward. People ate the cake out of obligation, washing down each dry bite with the coffee I'd brewed too strong because my hands shake now and I can never get the measurements quite right. Conversation stumbled along, punctuated by uncomfortable silences that grew longer as the afternoon wore on. Camille checked her phone 17 times in 20 minutes, I counted. When the last guest finally left, Lorraine squeezing my hand at the door and whispering fierce and protective, "You call me tonight, Elena." I mean it, only Camille, Preston, and Zara remained. Camille stood near the door, her designer purse already on her shoulder, keys in hand. "Well, Mom, we really should get going. Preston has a conference call with Singapore in an hour." I looked at her. Really looked at her. The tailored dress that probably cost a month of my Social Security. The highlights in her hair that required monthly maintenance. The subtle Botox that kept her forehead smooth and expressionless. She'd done well for herself, senior partner at a consulting firm downtown, 6-figure salary, house in the suburbs with a 3-car garage. But somewhere between medical school and her current life, she'd learned to measure worth in assets and liabilities. And by that calculation, her mother, a retired nurse living on a fixed income in a rent-controlled apartment in South Philly, registered as a liability she couldn't quite write off. "Camille," I said quietly, my voice carrying more steel than I'd intended. "Why the expired cake?" Her face flushed, color rising from her neck to her cheeks. Preston suddenly found something fascinating on his phone screen. It was just what they had left at the supermarket, Mom. I didn't have time to go to a proper bakery. Sunday traffic was. You had time to write a note. The air in the room shifted, molecules rearranging themselves into something denser, harder to breathe. Zara looked up from her iPad for the first time all afternoon, her dark eyes wide, sensing something in her grandmother's tone that made her small body tense. Camille's expression hardened, her jaw setting in that way that reminded me so much of Bernard. "I don't know what you're talking about." I pulled the note from my cardigan pocket, unfolded it with trembling fingers, not from age this time, but from the effort of keeping my anger controlled, and held it up between us like evidence in a trial. "This. You put this inside the cake." For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask cracked. I saw something flicker behind her eyes, not guilt exactly, but irritation. The irritation of someone caught doing something petty and being forced to acknowledge it. "That was, Mom, it was supposed to be ironic. A joke. You never did have much of a sense of humor about being called simple?" "I didn't mean it that way." "Then how did you mean it, Camille?" Silence filled the space between us, heavy and suffocating. Preston tugged at Camille's elbow, his voice low and urgent. "Honey, we should really go. You said you'd review those contracts before tomorrow's meeting." But I wasn't finished. 70 years on this earth had taught me patience. Lord knows I'd learned patience in emergency rooms watching children suffer, in the years of widowhood, in the slow erosion of my body's strength, but those same 70 years had also taught me when patience crosses the line into cowardice. "Your father and I gave you everything we had," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor that had started in my hands, spreading out my arms. "We worked ourselves to exhaustion so you'd never know what it felt like to be hungry, to be cold, to wonder if we could afford your textbooks or your school uniforms. We sacrificed so you could become everything you are now. I know that, Mom. I appreciate. Do you?" I stepped closer, and she actually took a step back. "Because that note doesn't sound like appreciation. It sounds like shame. Like you're embarrassed by where you came from. Like you wish your mother was someone else." Her face went red, then pale, then red again. "Maybe I am embarrassed." The words detonated in the small space of my living room. Preston inhaled sharply. Zara's iPad slipped from her hands onto the couch cushion. Even Camille looked shocked that she'd said it out loud, but now that the words were free, they seemed to give her permission to continue. "You want honesty? Fine. Yes, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed when my colleagues ask about my family and I have to explain that my mother lives in a one-bedroom apartment in South Philadelphia with furniture from the 1980s. I'm embarrassed when Preston's parents visit and suggest we invite you to their country club, and I have to make excuses because you don't own clothes appropriate for that environment." "Camille," Preston warned, but she wasn't stopping. "Do you know what it's like, Mom? To work this hard to build a certain life, to cultivate a certain image, and then have to explain that my mother still shops at thrift stores? That she takes the bus because she can't afford to maintain a car? That she what?" I asked, my voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "That she raised you in a neighborhood where people actually know each other's names? That she taught you that a person's worth isn't measured in their bank balance or their zip code?" Camille's mouth opened, closed. For the first time in the conversation, uncertainty flickered across her face. I walked slowly to the mantel where Bernard's photograph sat in a simple wooden frame. I'd taken that picture 15 years ago at Zara's baby naming ceremony. Bernard was holding his newborn granddaughter, his face transformed by wonder and joy, his large hands cradling her impossibly small body with infinite tenderness. He'd died 6 months later, heart attack on the number 23 bus, mid-route, passengers trying desperately to save him while the bus sat stopped at Broad in Washington. "Your father," I said, my fingers touching the frame gently, worked himself into an early grave so you could go to that fancy college. He died with his hands still aching from that steering wheel, with his back still hurting from 37 years in that driver's seat. I turned to face Camille directly. He never asked you to be grateful. He just wanted you to remember where you came from. To remember that the measure of a person isn't found in their stock portfolio or their house size. It's in how they treat people when there's nothing to gain from kindness. Camille's face had gone completely pale now. Zara was crying quietly, tears running down her face, and Preston pulled her close against his side. I think you should leave, I said, each word clear and final. Camille nodded stiffly, mechanically. She gathered her purse, her phone, herded her family toward the door. But she paused in the doorway, turned back. Mom, Go home, Camille. They left without another word. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like something ending, some relationship I'd thought was permanent revealed to be more fragile than I'd known. I stood alone in my apartment, surrounded by the remains of my 70th birthday party. Paper plates with cake crumbs, melting candles I'd bought 3 for $1 at the corner store, half of that stale, expired cake sitting on the table like physical evidence of my daughter's disdain. I should have felt angry, I suppose. Or devastated. But mostly I just felt tired, the deep, bone-tired exhaustion that comes from carrying weight you never expected to bear. I cleaned up slowly, my arthritic hands making the work take twice as long as it used to. I washed dishes in the sink because the dishwasher had broken 4 years ago and the landlord wouldn't fix it and I couldn't afford to replace it myself. Outside my window, Philadelphia hummed its Sunday evening song, church bells, car horns, the rumble of the Market Frankfurt line, voices in Spanish and English and Vietnamese rising from the street. When the kitchen was finally clean, I lowered myself carefully into my armchair, the one Bernard and I had bought at a furniture store on Washington Avenue when we were first married, reupholstered 4 times over the decades. I stared at Bernard's photograph for a long time. I tried, Bernie, I whispered to the image. I don't know where we went wrong with her, but Lord knows I tried. The photograph smiled back, unchanging, eternally holding that baby who had grown into a woman I barely recognized. I pulled the note from my pocket again, smoothed it out against my knee, read those cutting words one more time. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where I kept important documents, Bernard's death certificate, Camille's birth certificate, my nursing license, letters from my time with the Navy Nurse Corps during Vietnam. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling with its water stain shaped like the African continent, listening to Lorraine's television through the thin walls, and thought about the distance between mothers and daughters. How sometimes that distance is measured not in miles but in values. In the space between what you teach and what they choose to learn. Around 2:47 a.m., I could see the red numbers on my bedside clock. My phone buzzed. A text message. From Camille. Mom, I'm sorry about the note. It was inappropriate. But you have to understand, my life now is different from the one you lived. I can't keep apologizing for wanting more. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time, the blue light harsh in my dark bedroom. Then I turned off the phone without responding. Because some apologies aren't really apologies at all. They're just repackaged justifications. Ways of saying I'm sorry or hurt without actually admitting wrongdoing. Without actually changing. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go to Temple Hospital where I used to work. The pediatric ward would still be there, I'd checked online. Maybe they'd let me volunteer, let me hold the babies whose mothers needed to sleep, let me remember who I used to be before I became an embarrassment. Before I became simple. That thought sustained me through the long night, through the sounds of the city waking up, through the first gray light of dawn creeping through my curtains that hadn't been replaced in 15 years. By the time the sun rose fully, painting my bedroom walls in shades of gold and amber, I had made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because 70 years on this earth had taught me something Camille hadn't learned yet in her 39, dignity isn't granted by others. It's claimed for yourself. And sometimes, just sometimes, the simple people turn out to be anything but simple. The whispers started 3 days after my birthday. I first heard them at the bodega. Miguel was ringing up my groceries, bread, eggs, a small container of milk, when Mrs. Patel from down the block came in. She didn't see me standing by the refrigerated section, half hidden behind a display of canned beans. "Terrible thing," she was saying to Miguel in a low voice. "That daughter of Elena's. My niece works at her firm downtown. Says Camille told people at the office her mother was becoming difficult. Said she might need to look into assisted living facilities." Miguel's face darkened. "Elena is sharp as a tack. Sharper than most people half her age. I know that. You know that. But Camille's painting a different picture to anyone who'll listen. Says her mother is deteriorating, can't be trusted to manage her own affairs." I stood frozen behind the display, my hand gripping a can of black beans so hard my knuckles turned white. Mrs. Patel continued, "My niece says Camille's been asking about power of attorney. About guardianship laws." The can slipped from my hand, clattering against the floor. Both of them turned, saw me standing there. Mrs. Patel's face flooded with mortification. "Elena, I didn't." "It's fine," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. I picked up the can, placed it back on the shelf with deliberate care. "Thank you for telling me." I paid for my groceries and left, but Miguel called after me. "Elena, wait." I paused at the door. "You need to protect yourself," he said quietly. "Whatever she's planning, you need to be ready." I nodded and stepped out into the September heat that made the pavement shimmer like water. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in front of me, thinking about guardianship. About power of attorney. About what it means when your own child decides you're no longer competent to manage your own life. My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. "Lorraine. You still up?" she asked. "Can't sleep." "Come down. I made pie." I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and took the stairs down to her apartment. She opened the door before I could knock, her silver hair in rollers, her face creased with concern. "Apple pie," she said, guiding me to her kitchen table. "With cinnamon, the way you like it." She cut me a generous slice, poured coffee even though it was nearly midnight. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the tick of her wall clock and the distant rumble of traffic on Washington Avenue. "I heard what Mrs. Patel told you," Lorraine finally said. "Miguel called me." "Of course he did." I managed a weak smile. "Elena, baby, you need to talk to someone. A lawyer, maybe." "I don't have money for lawyers, Lorraine. You know that." She reached across the table and gripped my hand. Her skin was warm, her grip firm despite her 73 years. "Then we find someone who'll help. Because I've known you 22 years, and there's not a damn thing wrong with your mind." Tears pricked at my eyes. I blinked them back. She really thinks I'm losing it. Or she's trying to make other people think that. Which is worse? Lorraine asked softly. I didn't have an answer. She squeezed my hand tighter. "You remember Darnell? My nephew, the one who just passed the bar." I nodded. I'd met him at Lorraine's summer cookout, a bright young man with his grandmother's kind eyes. He does pro bono work. Civil rights, elder law. I'm calling him tomorrow. Lorraine. No arguments. You were there for me when James died. You held my hand through chemo. You don't get to face this alone. I squeezed her hand back, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Flashback, 8 years ago. Camille had just made partner at her firm. She invited Bernard and me to the celebration dinner at some restaurant in Center City where the menu didn't have prices listed, never a good sign for people like us. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I kept for special occasions. Bernard wore his suit, the one he'd bought for Camille's wedding 10 years earlier. We took the bus downtown, transferred twice, arrived 15 minutes early because Bernard hated being late for anything. The restaurant was all dark wood and soft lighting, with waiters who moved like dancers and wine lists thick as telephone books. Camille was already there with Preston, at a table near the window overlooking Rittenhouse Square. She hugged us both, and for a moment, she was my little girl again, the one who'd worn that toy stethoscope everywhere, who'd bandaged her dolls and diagnosed them with elaborate conditions she'd made up. "I'm so proud of you, baby," Bernard said, his voice thick. "Thanks, Daddy." She'd stopped calling him that years ago, but tonight it slipped out, and his face lit up like sunrise. Dinner was awkward. The portions were tiny, arranged on plates like abstract art. Bernard kept looking at his plate confused, probably wondering where the rest of his meal was. I tried to decode the menu, with its French phrases and ingredients I'd never heard of. But Camille was radiant, talking about her cases, her clients, the corner office she'd earned. Preston ordered wine that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. When the check came, they insisted on paying. "You've done enough for me," Camille said, and the way she said it, it sounded grateful. Genuine. On the bus ride home, Bernard held my hand. "Our girl's going to be fine," he said. "Better than fine." "I know," I said, resting my head on his shoulder. But even then, I felt the distance opening. Saw how Camille's eyes had lingered on Bernard's worn suit, on my dress that was probably 15 years out of style. Heard the slight hesitation before she introduced us to her colleagues at the next table. The gap was already there. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Back to present. Darnell Jackson arrived at my apartment on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a leather briefcase that looked professionally broken in rather than fashionably distressed. He was 32, with his grandmother's warm eyes and his own sharp intelligence that made you understand immediately why he'd been first in his law school class. "Miss Elena," he said, shaking my hand. "Aunt Lorraine's told me about the situation." We sat at my kitchen table. I made coffee, the good stuff I saved for company, and laid out everything. The expired cake. The note. The overheard conversation about guardianship. Darnell took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving quickly. When I finished, he sat back, tapping his pen against his lips. "Okay," he said finally. "First thing, are you experiencing any cognitive decline? Any memory issues, confusion, difficulty managing daily tasks?" "No. I pay my bills on time. I take my medications correctly. I can tell you every patient I treated during my last shift at Temple, and that was 8 years ago." He smiled. "That's what I thought." Second question, does Camille have any legal basis for seeking guardianship? "Not that I know of." Good. Because guardianship is serious. A court would need clear evidence of incapacity. But even accusations can be damaging, especially if she's planting seeds with people who might be called as witnesses. My stomach clenched. "What do I do?" "We document everything. We establish your competency clearly. And we make it very difficult for anyone to paint you as incapable." He leaned forward. "Miss Elena, I'm going to be blunt. This sounds less like genuine concern for your well-being and more like someone trying to gain control of your assets. I don't have assets. This apartment is rent-controlled. I have maybe $8,000 in savings and my Social Security. You have a rent-controlled apartment in South Philadelphia. Do you know what those are worth to developers? If she could get guardianship, she could decide where you live. Could move you to a facility, terminate your lease." The room seemed to tilt. "She wouldn't." Darnell's expression was gentle but firm. "Miss Elena, she gave you an expired cake with a note calling you simple. What do you think she would or wouldn't do?" The next morning, I went to Temple Hospital. I hadn't been back in years, the memories were too sharp, too painful. The pediatric ward where I'd spent 32 years, where I'd held dying children and celebrated recoveries, where I'd learned that the human heart could break and keep beating. The building had been renovated since I'd retired. New paint, new signage, gleaming floors. But the smell was the same, antiseptic and hope mixed together in equal measures. I found my way to administration, asked to speak with whoever was in charge of the volunteer program. They sent me to a woman named Keisha Washington, young enough to be my granddaughter, with kind eyes and an efficient manner. I used to work here, I told her. Pediatric ward, 1974 to 2006. I'd like to volunteer. She pulled up something on her computer. Elena Martinez? You're in our system. Excellent record. Why'd you leave? My husband got sick. I took early retirement to care for him. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. We'd love to have you back. We're actually desperate for volunteers in pediatrics. When can you start? Tomorrow? She smiled. Tomorrow works. I started volunteering 3 days a week. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. 4-hour shifts holding babies whose mothers needed to sleep, reading to children recovering from surgery, teaching teenagers with long-term stays how to play poker with tongue depressors instead of chips. It felt like coming home. On my third Saturday, I was reading where the wild things are to a 5-year-old named Marcus who'd just had his appendix removed when I heard a familiar voice in the hallway. Yes, my mother used to work here. Years ago. I'm just trying to get a sense of whether there were any incidents, any signs of decline. Camille. My hands tightened on the book. Marcus looked up at me, confused by my sudden tension. Sorry, sweetheart, I said, forcing my voice steady. Just remembered something. Let's keep reading. But I couldn't focus on the words. Couldn't focus on anything except my daughter's voice drifting down the hallway, asking questions designed to paint a picture of a woman losing her grip. After my shift, I found Keisha in her office. Did my daughter come here today? I asked without preamble. Keisha's face flushed. Miss Elena, Please. Just tell me. She sighed. Yes. She came asking questions about your time here, about why you left, whether there were any concerns about your performance. And what did you tell her? I told her your personnel file was confidential, and that in my brief experience with you, you're one of the most competent people I've ever met. Keisha's jaw set. I also told her that if she had concerns about your well-being, she should speak with you directly instead of trying to gather ammunition behind your back. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. Miss Elena, I don't know what's going on between you two, but that woman wasn't acting like a concerned daughter. She was acting like a prosecutor building a case. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with Darnell. He'd brought his laptop, several file folders, and a grim expression. I did some digging, he said. Your daughter's firm represents several real estate development companies. One of them, Apex Development, has been buying up properties in this neighborhood for the past 3 years. He turned his laptop to show me a map. Red dots marked buildings Apex had acquired, clustered in a pattern that was slowly surrounding my block. They're planning a major redevelopment project. Luxury condos, upscale retail. But they need the whole block. And rent-controlled tenants are obstacles. He looked at me seriously. If your daughter could gain guardianship, she could make decisions about your housing. Could agree to buyouts on your behalf. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. How much would they pay for me to leave? For a rent-controlled unit in this location? Probably 50, 60,000. Maybe more. And Camille would get to control that money. As your guardian, yes. She'd have discretion over your finances. I stood up, walked to the window. Outside, Philadelphia was settling into evening. Street lights flickering on. Kids playing basketball at the corner court. Mrs. Patel watering her flowers. Miguel closing up the bodega. My neighborhood. My home for 42 years. She's trying to sell me out, I said softly. It looks that way. I turned back to him. So what do we do? Darnell smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a young lawyer who'd grown up in neighborhoods like this, who understood what gentrification meant, who knew how to fight. We document your competency so thoroughly that no court would even consider guardianship. And then we make sure that if your daughter tries to pursue this, it backfires spectacularly. Over the next 2 weeks, Darnell arranged everything. I underwent a complete cognitive assessment with a neuropsychologist. Dr. Sarachan spent 4 hours putting me through memory tests, problem-solving exercises, evaluations of judgment and reasoning. When she finished, she looked at me with something like awe. "Mrs. Martinez, you're functioning at the level of someone 20 years younger. Your memory is exceptional. Your reasoning is sound. There is absolutely no evidence of cognitive decline." She paused. "Why did you need this evaluation?" "My daughter thinks I'm incompetent." Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "Well, I'll be happy to testify otherwise if it comes to that." Darnell also arranged for me to meet with my primary care physician, Dr. Okafor, who I'd been seeing for 15 years. He documented my excellent health, my medication compliance, my independence in all activities of daily living. "Elena," he said when we finished, "you're healthier than most 60-year-olds I see. Who's questioning your capacity?" "My daughter." His face fell. "I'm sorry. That must be painful." "It is," I said simply. But the pain was hardening into something else now. Something sharper, more focused. Determination. Flashback, 45 years ago, Vietnam. I was 25, a Navy nurse stationed on the USS Sanctuary Hospital ship off the coast of Vietnam. The wounded came in waves, Marines barely old enough to vote, their bodies torn by bullets and shrapnel, their eyes haunted by things they'd never be able to unsee. I worked 18-hour shifts in surgery, my hands steady even when my heart was breaking. Held IVs while doctors operated. Whispered comfort to boys crying for their mothers. Learned to function on 3 hours of sleep and coffee that could strip paint. One night, they brought in a young soldier with a sucking chest wound. Maybe 19 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes wide with terror. "Am I going to die?" he asked me, his voice barely a whisper. I grabbed his hand. "Not on my watch, Marine." We worked on him for 6 hours. The doctors said it was hopeless, wanted to move on to patients they could save. But something in me refused to accept that. Refused to let this boy's mother get a telegram when maybe, just maybe, we could save him. "One more try," I insisted. "Please." The surgeon looked at me, exhausted, covered in blood. Then he nodded. "One more try." We saved him. I got a commendation for it, though I never felt like I deserved it. I was just doing my job. Just refusing to give up when giving up was easier. That's what my time in Vietnam taught me. When you're fighting for something that matters, you don't quit. You don't fold just because the odds are bad. You keep fighting, keep pushing, keep believing that maybe, just maybe, you can win. Back to present. 3 weeks after my birthday, Camille called. Not a text this time, an actual phone call. "Mom, we need to talk." "I'm listening." "I've been thinking, maybe it would be better if you moved closer to us. We found a nice assisted living facility in our area. It's very well rated. You'd have your own room, activities, medical care on site." My grip on the phone tightened. "I don't need assisted living, Camille. I'm perfectly capable of living independently." "Mom, be reasonable. You're 70. You live alone in a neighborhood that's not getting any safer. What if something happens? Then my neighbors will help me. Like they've been doing for 42 years. Those people aren't your family. They've acted more like family lately than my actual daughter." Silence on the other end. Then her voice, colder now. "Mom, I'm trying to help you. But if you won't accept help voluntarily, there are other options. Like guardianship." Another pause. Longer this time. "How did you?" "Did you really think people wouldn't tell me? That I wouldn't find out you've been asking questions, building a case, trying to paint me as incompetent? I'm concerned about you. That's all." "No, Camille. You're concerned about this apartment. About the development deal. About the money you could make if you could force me out. That's ridiculous. I'm your daughter. I want what's best for you. Then why did you give me an expired cake? Why did you write that note? Why have you spent years making me feel like I'm an embarrassment? Her voice rose. Because you are. Do you know what it's like to be successful, to work this hard to build something, and have to explain that my mother lives in a rent-controlled apartment and shops at thrift stores? To watch you show up to family events in clothes that are 20 years old? So this is about your image. This is about reality, Mom. About accepting that you can't keep living like it's 1982. The world has moved on. I've moved on. Maybe it's time you did too. By moving into a facility so you can terminate my lease and pocket the buyout money? Oh my God, you've been listening to those neighbors of yours. They've poisoned your mind. No, Camille. You did that yourself. With every dismissive comment, every embarrassed look, every time you treated your father and me like we were burdens instead of people who sacrificed everything for you. I have to go. We'll talk about this later when you're being more rational. She hung up. I sat holding the dead phone for a long time, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from rage. From the cumulative weight of years of small cruelties building to this moment. Then I called Darnell. She made her move, I told him. Threaten guardianship if I don't go voluntarily to assisted living. Good, he said, and I could hear the anticipation in his voice. That's actually perfect. Now we respond. The next day, Darnell filed a preemptive petition with the court. It included Dr. Chen's cognitive evaluation, Dr. Okafor's medical assessment, character statements from my neighbors, documentation of my volunteer work at Temple Hospital, and a detailed explanation of the conflict of interest, that Camille's firm represented a development company trying to acquire my building. This establishes your competency before she can file for guardianship, Darnell explained. And it puts on record that her motives aren't about your well-being. What happens now? Now we wait. And we prepare. Because when she realizes what we've done, she's going to escalate. He was right. 2 days later, I got a call from Adult Protective Services. Someone had filed a report claiming I was being financially exploited by my neighbors, that I was showing signs of dementia, that I was at risk. The investigator who came to my apartment was a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Janet Reeves. She looked around my clean apartment, asked me questions about my daily routine, reviewed my medication list, checked my bank statements. Mrs. Martinez, she finally said, I don't see any evidence of exploitation or cognitive decline. In fact, you seem more organized than most people I encounter. Who filed this report? My daughter. Understanding dawned in her eyes. I see. And why would your daughter file a false report? Because I won't do what she wants. Janet closed her notebook. I'm going to write this up as unfounded. But Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know, false reports are a form of harassment. If this continues, you may want to consider a restraining order. After she left, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not from fear, but from grief. From the death of the relationship I thought I had with my daughter. From the loss of the little girl who'd once called me the best mama in the world. Lorraine found me there an hour later, let herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me and held my hand until the tears stopped. We're going to win this, she said finally. You know that, right? I wiped my eyes. I know. But winning feels like losing when it's against your own child. Then we make sure the truth comes out. Make sure everyone sees what she's really doing. I looked at my friend of 22 years, at the strength in her eyes, the steel in her spine. How? She smiled. We tell your story. The real one. The one she doesn't want anyone to hear. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about Bernard. About what he would say if he could see what our daughter had become. I tried, Bernie, I whispered into the darkness. God knows I tried. But even as I said it, I knew I hadn't failed. I'd raised Camille with love, with values, with everything we had. The choices she'd made since, those were hers alone. Around 3 a.m., I got up, made tea, and sat at my kitchen table. I pulled out a box I kept in the back of my closet, full of photos from Camille's childhood. Her first day of school. Her high school graduation. Her medical school acceptance letter that we'd all cried over. Her wedding day, when Bernard had walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. I looked at each photo, remembering. Then I put them all away except one, the picture from her 7th birthday, when she'd opened that doctor's bag and screamed with joy. I propped it up on my kitchen table where I could see it. A reminder of who she'd been. And maybe, somewhere deep down, who she still could be. But I wasn't counting on it. Not anymore. Because the battle ahead wasn't about saving our relationship. That was already gone. This battle was about protecting myself, my home, my dignity. About proving that you don't stop fighting just because the enemy is someone you love. The sun rose slowly over Philadelphia, painting my kitchen walls gold. Somewhere in the suburbs, my daughter was probably already awake, planning her next move.